Hello, people.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All these nice and bright and shiny faces. Everybody looks like they had a really good rest last night, did you? Or were you out on the town? So this morning we really need your focus. We have two plenary sessions planned back to back. The first on policy and legislation, followed by equality and economic empowerment. So Raymond, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I had very good rest last night. And for the first session this morning, policy and legislation, we're going to critically examine international standards and also goals. We're also going to explore some innovative strategies that improve accountability and also coordination, as well as identify laws and policies that could help protect victims and end violence and abuse. And now, to talk about Taiwan shelter service policy for women survivors of violence. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for this morning, Lin Wei-Yan, Director General of Department of Protective Services, Ministry of Health and Welfare. Let's welcome Ms. Lin.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I'm Wei-Yan Lin, Director General of Department of Protective Services in the Ministry of Health and Welfare. Today, I'd like to share with you about our shelter policies and the services for abused women in Taiwan. The report can be largely divided into 4 parts. In this slide, we review the development of shelter service for abused women in Taiwan. Before 1989, shelter for abused women mainly depended on the existing social assistance system. From 89 to 98, we started to set up shelters for misfortunate women. Then, in 1998, we promulgated the Domestic Violence Prevention Act. And the shelter for abused women became more systematic and specialized. Shelter system improved after 2008. And before 1989, there were 6 public shelters for poor, elder, sick, disabled, and abused women. They provided shelter services, skill training, and employment assistance to help them to get back on their feet. Besides, in 1987, Elimination Home is established, which was the first private shelter in Taiwan. Let's move to the start-up stage. With the development of Taiwan's social welfare, we started to compose budgets to subsidize local governments and NGOs to provide shelter services for misfortunate women, such as single moms, divorcees, widows, and abused women. What services did they provide in these shelters? They provide not only the emergency and short-term shelter services, but also legal consultation, counseling, and economic assistance, depending on clients' needs. Besides, Safe Home is the first public to private shelter for victims of domestic violence. In 1998, we promulgated the Domestic Violence Prevention Act. According to this act, local governments should provide emergency shelter for abused women. Recognizing that Emergency shelter alone did not fully satisfy the needs for abused women. In 2007, the Domestic Violence Prevention Act was amended. It was further stipulated that local government must provide victims with short-term, mid- and long-term shelters. In 2008, the Ministry of Health and Welfare created standards for abused women's shelters. The shelter policies and the services for abused women was gradually improved. We began to subsidize local governments and NGOs to provide mid- and long-term shelter services. This was necessary because we recognize that economic security and housing stability were key for assisting abused women who left home. Taiwan has 22 counties. There are 37 shelters within 19 counties, among which 26 are short-term shelters and 11 are mid- and long-term shelters. I know that in some countries, most shelters are set up by NGOs. However, in Taiwan, all shelter services are provided by government. Some are public to private. Among the 37 shelters, most are commissioned private institutes and some are public to private. They usually lease houses, apartments, or buildings for shelter. Most shelters are small scale. In 2018, the number of female victims of intimate partner violence is nearly 24,000, and about 5% of them accepted shelter service. In Taiwan, all abused women's shelters also provide shelter for minor children. As the right chart shows, the nationality of sheltering abused women are mainly Taiwanese. However, new immigrants comprise about 13%. What services do we now provide? To answer this, we need to look at the two stages, during shelter and post-shelter. First, when a woman is in a shelter, the shelter not only provides accommodation, but also provides individual and group counseling to assist her and her children. After they leave shelters, social workers will do follow-up and provide them with specialized services to help them rebuild their lives. Based on research in 2015, about 43% abused women stay within 1 week. The average period is only 3.5 days. The period over 30 days comprises only about 23%. When we reviewed the occupation rate of shelters, we found that Taiwan's short-term shelters for abused women are occupied about 42%. The main obstacles we face are of two types. First, in terms of facilities, many shelter buildings are old and require renovation. Because the buildings of shelters in most counties are leased, it is more difficult to renovate facilities. Second, due to the lack of good facilities, most victims do not like to stay in the shelter for a long time. In addition, our mid- and long-term shelter resources are not enough, so that victims need to lease a house by themselves. They may end up going back to the violent relationship because of economically disadvantaged. Let's look at how we plan to continue improving into the future. First, we have requested local governments to review their current shelter facilities and have subsidized the local governments for improvement. Second, for victims who decide to leave home, safe and stable residence is key for them to escape a violent relationship and gradually become independent. Therefore, we have composed a budget that facilitates local governments' cooperation with communities and NGOs to build long-term shelters. Third, to obtain more workforce and to improve shelter service, we have begun to increase staff salaries and will instruct local governments to review the necessity of 24-hour shifts for shelters to increase staff retention rate. Finally, we will continue to improve and create a more victim-centered and trauma-informed shelter service. As I mentioned, we will continue work to prevent domestic violence and to protect victims' rights. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lin Wei-An, for your inspiring speech. Thank you very much. So up next, a woman who has over 4 decades of experience in social justice and in human rights. She's involved in matters concerning sex and gender and race and class and their intersections. She was also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women from 2009 to 2015. She's currently a professor at the Human Rights Program at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and she's here today to talk about her vision for radical solutions to end violence against women and to achieve gender justice. Please welcome Rashida Manjoo. These things happen, people. Nothing wrong, we say in Jamaica. Thank you, Ms. Manjoo. Just wait for your pedestal. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Once again, Rashida Manjoo.
Thank you very much for that, and I'm hoping to see familiar faces in the audience. Distinguished delegates, colleagues and friends, it is an honor for me to participate in this conference and to provide a perspective on international developments in respect of violence against women. Thank you to the organizers, the Global Network on Women's Shelters, the hosts, the Garden of Hope Foundation, and the sponsors, the Ministry of Health and Welfare. The input by the Director General of the Department of Protective Services on the government's shelter policy reflects the importance of codifying state responsibility to provide accommodation for abused women as reflected in the Domestic Violence Prevention Act. The obligation of the local government to provide short, mid and long-term shelter is a positive example of how state responsibility is incorporated into legislation. The challenge, of course, is the low uptake rate by women of shelter accommodation, which is about 5% on one of the slides, and that's a reflection of how much more work is necessary to address the personal, the institutional, cultural, and societal factors that influence and shape the decisions of women about moving into shelters. As we know, the violations of women's human rights, whether linked to civil, political, economic, social, cultural, or developmental aspects, is a widespread problem globally. Violence against women and girls is acknowledged as one of the most pervasive human rights violations that we face today. The forms, the prevalence, and consequences of violence experienced by women has led to numerous reports which analyze the legal and institutional developments, including on the effectiveness or lack thereof of access to remedies for violations of this human rights violation. Currently, an important conversation is taking place about how to achieve a more effective international response to violence against women. The questions are framed broadly as: should we strengthen the existing legal frameworks? Should we adopt a standalone international treaty focused solely on violence against women? Or should we adopt a new optional protocol to CEDAW with its own monitoring body that is focused solely on violence? Supporters of a new international treaty recognize the urgent need to establish uniformity, specificity, and state accountability through a binding global instrument rather than maintaining the status quo with various inadequate standards and obligations for different regions of the world. It is argued that the vast knowledge that we have developed over decades about practices and lessons learned at the national and regional levels need to be drawn on in the development of an international legally binding treaty. The importance of accountability derives from concerns about the failures of states in their responsibility to act with due diligence in responding to and preventing violations of women's human rights. The principles of dignity, equality, freedom, justice, and peace underpin the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is over 70 years old. Article 2 notes that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set out without distinction of any kind. The right to life, liberty, and security of the person is included in Article 3, and the right not to be subjected to torture or to cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment in Article 5. If we link Articles 2, 3, and 5, it is clear that these rights apply to all women and girls without distinction, which is crucial for a life free of all forms of violence. There is global recognition that violence against women is a pervasive and widespread human rights violation that exists across the world. It has been labeled as an epidemic by the World Health Organization, and the indicators are that violence against women is the foremost cause of death and disability among women. This is in a World Health Organization report. UN Women has noted that malaria, cancer, traffic accidents, and war combined kill fewer women than violence against women, and this is most often at the hands of people that they know. As I noted in a report to the General Assembly on the subject of gender-related killings of women, the death of a woman is the ultimate act of violence in a continuum of violence that women experience. It is not a new act and is in fact a reflection of the failure in the responses of states to other acts of violence that have been experienced. For more than 4 decades, the global movement to combat violence against women has strived to ensure that the issues relating to women and gender-based violence are discussed within a human rights discourse. However, it was not until the Second World Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980 that a resolution was adopted on battered women and violence within the family. As positive a development as this was, violence against women was not characterized as a human rights violation, but rather as a social problem within the ambit of health policies. In 1985, at the World Conference on Women in Nairobi, violence against women emerged as an issue of serious global concern that needed the attention of the international community. Subsequent UN World Conferences, including Beijing, Cairo, and Vienna, have reinforced and expanded on the issue of violence against women as a human rights violation. Unfortunately, the text of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, CEDAW, does not explicitly address violence against women. Article 2 of CEDAW refers to the obligation of states to pursue by all appropriate means and without delay a policy of eliminating discrimination against women. But there are no provisions which deal specifically with the issue of violence against women or the state's responsibility to act with due diligence to eliminate all forms of violence. The only article linked to violence is Article 6, which deals with sex trafficking and prostitution. To address this shortcoming, the CEDAW Committee has issued interpretive guidelines in the form of general recommendations 12, 19, 30, and 35 linked to violence against women. Other general recommendations make reference to violence where relevant. General recommendations of a treaty body are not legally binding. These are the interpretations of a treaty body. The optional protocol to CEDAW allows for the submission of individual and collective petitions alleging discrimination. In respect of individual complaints mechanisms, approximately 120 cases have been registered since the optional protocol came into effect in the year 2000, with approximately 50% being admissible. The committee has finalized 14 communications, 1-4, focusing on violence against women. Such decisions have covered sterilization, forced sterilization, domestic violence, rape, sexual harassment, stalking, etc. The low statistics are worrying considering the widespread and pervasive problem that we are facing. In 1993, the General Assembly adopted by consensus a declaration on the elimination of violence against women. The declaration reflects some provisions found in CEDAW General Recommendation 19, but provides a more thorough and explicit statement on violence. But the declaration does not give rise to legally binding obligations. It's a declaration. It's a soft law instrument. In addition, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and the Security Council have adopted numerous non-binding resolutions, specifically dealing with violence against women. These resolutions have increasingly identified inequality, discrimination, and gender-based violence as violations of human rights of women, and have referred to the heightened risk of gender-based violence for women who suffer multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. Despite all these developments, violence against women remains a pervasive, widespread, and unacceptable reality throughout the world, with the World Health Organization arguing that it is a global public health problem of epidemic proportions requiring urgent actions. If this was a medical emergency, a medical epidemic, we declare a state of emergency globally. At the regional level, the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, the Convention of Belém do Pará in 1994, is the first legally binding instrument in which state parties agree to a series of concrete measures and programs to address this human rights violation. The protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Maputo Protocol, adopted in 2003, aims to protect women's rights in a comprehensive manner. Although it's not exclusively dedicated to violence against women, the protocol includes definitions as well as crucial provisions, including on female genital mutilation, rape, and provisions on the abuse of women in the advertising and pornography. The Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which entered into force in 2014, provides a comprehensive regional legal framework to protect women against all forms of violence and to prevent, prosecute, and eliminate violence and domestic violence. The Inter-American Convention is the only violence against women human rights treaty which includes an individual complaints mechanism. The other two regional treaties do not. The consequence of the absence of formal regional human rights systems in the rest of the world reflects the lack of a normative framework for these regions. Under international human rights policy developments, it is argued that states are obliged to prevent and to respond to all acts of violence against women. In my reports to the United Nations, I've argued that there is a need to create a framework for discussing the responsibility of states to act with due diligence through separating the due diligence standard into two categories. Individual due diligence, which states owe to individual victims of violence, and systemic due diligence, which requires states to create a functioning and responsive system to eliminate violence against women. The obligation to act with due diligence also requires states to hold accountable not only those who perpetrate violations of human rights of women, but also those who fail to protect against and prevent harm from occurring. There continues to be a lack of response to addressing individual, communal, structural, and institutional factors that are a cause and a consequence of violence. Thus, we need state responsibility to include both individual and systemic due diligence obligations. Moving from soft law to standard setting to legally binding obligations, there is a growing concern that women and girls who are victims of violence are inadequately protected and served by the current human rights law and practice. There is a gap between the human rights standards set out in soft law policy documents at the international level and the adoption of such standards by national governments. For example, more than 600 million women live in countries where domestic violence is not a crime. As mentioned, currently an important conversation is taking place about how to achieve a more effective international response. My final reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly late in 2015 reiterate my view of the normative gap. I saw a sign for 3 minutes, and the need for a new international convention. During my tenure as a Special Rapporteur, I initiated a process of consultations and dialogues, including the normative gap in international law in respect of violence. The submissions included individual information on research and advocacy efforts of civil society organizations. Proponents of a new treaty stress that a legal framework that relies on creative interpretations of general human rights law is inadequate to address the nuance and specificity required to combat violence against women. CEDAW is inadequate as it lacks legally binding provisions on violence against women, including explicit definitions and articulations of state responsibility. Proponents argue that conflating violence against women and discrimination against women results in an inadequate or incomplete description of the legal concept of violence against women as a human rights violation in and of itself. They also argue that addressing impunity is a crucial step to ending violence against women, and a new treaty could give activists and advocates a tool that they need for accountability as well as for state actors to adopt and implement laws. In addition, there is an argument that there is insufficient dialogue within the mandate of other treaty mechanisms, specifically on violence against women. The current UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has recognized the need to address the gap between international human rights norms and standards and their implementation at the national level. And she has received responses, and particularly from civil society organizations. A majority of civil society organizations argued for the adoption of a new treaty, which would be specifically on violence against women. It would be comprehensive and legally binding and reflect uniformity, specificity, and state accountability, which we don't have at the moment. Some respondents did express concern about the soft law and the non-binding nature of the current legal framework and the need for a new separate treaty with its own monitoring body or an optional protocol to CEDAW. These people who support a new treaty argue that there is an urgent need to establish the uniformity, specificity, and state accountability through a binding legal global instrument, rather than maintaining the status quo with 3 regional systems having treaties and the rest of the world not having any. the current Special Rapporteur has recognized that there is a gap and that a significant number of submissions pointed out that the lack of a specific global treaty on gender-based violence had important symbolic value and further indicated that a new treaty could have an important role in galvanizing implementation at the state level. In 1996, the first Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women argued that the international community should consider the possibility of adopting an international convention on the elimination of violence against women. There does not exist a comprehensive international legally binding instrument on violence against women. And in 2015, I argued the same perspective, that there is a normative gap and we need to do something. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Manju. May I ask you to use this chair, please? So, I think baby needs a new nappy. Are you a baby? Ms. Manju, I will call on stage a panel now to discuss further what you have been talking about. So first of all, from the Netherlands, the former CEO of Blijf Group, member of the board of GNWS, and member of the European Grevio Committee that oversees implementation of the Istanbul Convention, Aleid van der Brink. Member of the Japanese Parliament, she's a former Minister of Gender Equality, the writer of over 30 books, and the author of many domestic violence laws in Japan. Please welcome Mizuho Fukushima. And her interpreter. And the Secretary of the National Women Commission in Nepal, Mr. Dipendra Kafle. Please come on and join us. Good morning, sir. So, this is your microphone, by the way, Ms. Manju. Thank you. And Ms. van der Brink, you have your microphone there. The others have their own sound, I believe, I hope. We'll find out. So, following on what Ms. Manju just said, let me first ask Ms. van der Brink and Ms. Fukushima and Mr. Kafle, very briefly, what is your vision for achieving gender justice and ending violence against women? Who would like? Ms. van der Brink.
Yes, I would really like to do that. Good morning to you all. I'm very honored to be here and grateful that we are here gathered with so many people. I really feel it in my heart. Well, Ms. Manju, of course, has raised important issues about legal frameworks and a global legal framework as a necessary thing to make progress together. I am in the position of being a member of Grevio, that is the monitoring body of the Istanbul Convention in Europe. It's a young convention, this convention. It's only came into force since 2014, but already more than 30 countries have ratified. And so now there is a possibility to monitor the first baseline implementation stadium of all these countries. And what I really appreciate and what I like and what I think is necessary is to make human rights legal frameworks, to connect them close to the real work on the floor, the work all the women's shelters do. The Istanbul Convention has made this more concrete than CEDAW could do, because it is a broader convention, and it really makes it possible to point at the gaps that the countries have. So I think that's a good way to make progress.
Thank you. What would your comments be, Mr. Kafle, on this question?
Everyone in this beautiful city. As all of us in this room are aware of the root of cause of violence against women is social norms and culture. Hence, I feel we need to change social norms and values, reform discriminatory laws, harmful cultural practice needs to be criminalized, emphasis on men and boys engagement, and strengthen the public-private partnership, and focus the curriculum of school level against GBV. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fukushima, do you have a brief view on this question, please?
はい、どうも皆さんこんにちは。日本から来ました福島みずほです。ですね、日本で2001年に DV 防止法ができますが、外国の視察をするなど、それがインパクトを大変もらいました。ですから、女性差別撤廃条約の勧告なども有効なので、さっきのマンチュさんの話を聞きながら、一つは国連がある種の女性に対する暴力撤廃の条約を作る、あるいは女性差別撤廃委員会がある種の説明責任を求める監視機構を作る。で、イスタンブール条約については、日本はヨーロッパ評議会のオブザバステーサスを持っていますが、イスタンブール条約みたいなものをもっと広げるなどが極めて有効なのではないかというふうに思います。
Could you please?
Okay. Hi, I'm Mizuho Fukushima from Japan. In Japan, anti-domestic violence law was enacted in 2001, and it was partly because of the overseas inspection that we did as women legislators. And also, I think it's really important to have general recommendations from a CEDAW committee, and like Ms. Manju said, it would be really effective that if we have the United Nations Treaty or CEDAW committee's monitoring mechanism, or as talked in the previous comments, the Istanbul Convention would be really effective, and Japan is one of the observant states of Council of Europe, so I really like to have conventions like that.
Thank you very much. Ms. Manju, one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has set for the year 2030 is achieving gender equality. So what do you think governments can do to follow up on that promise to mankind, womankind, and how realistic is it really?
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the panelists. I think that there is an acknowledgement that there is a normative gap, and I think as much as the Council of Europe Treaty is the kind of most developed that we have currently, there are lessons to be learned. But if we believe in the universality of human rights, then we have to start thinking of an international treaty that is of universal applicability and not just certain regions of the world. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, I just want to remind all of us that one of the central promises of the SDGs is leave no one behind, which is an important message. The commitment is to eradicate poverty in all its forms, to end discrimination and exclusion, and to reduce inequalities and vulnerabilities. And when I think of that, it seems like a tall order to achieve by 2030. And I have a very pragmatic thought on this, is that in the next 11 years, we're not going to achieve this, leave no one behind. And we're not going to achieve that because you have to think of the centuries of discrimination and oppression and inequalities that women have experienced and continue to experience. So 11 years is a short time, but we need to take the message of leave no one behind seriously and to develop plans for the long term.
So are you saying we're not achieving it in 11 years, or we're not achieving it full stop? Which one is it?
No, we're not achieving it, leave no one behind in 11 years.
11 years.
Because think of the centuries of oppression and discrimination, and the patriarchy is alive and well in all our contexts.
Definitely.
And I can't see how 11 years is going to lead us to a position where we can say we have eradicated poverty, we've eliminated discrimination globally. But I'm not negative about it.
Might I put you on the spot and ask you what time frame would work?
Well, in Africa we have a 2063 goal, and I think it's so arbitrary. Because as long as we don't address the individual, the institutional, the structural, the factors that impact the lives and realities and contexts of women, we can't set arbitrary figures, because first we need that commitment to address the structural aspects.
The structural aspects, that's what needs to be done first. Thank you. Ms. van der Brink, within the European context, what do you think governments are doing right, and where do they leave the gaps?
Well, Europe is not one country. The Council of Europe.
Let's talk about the Netherlands and then the neighbors.
Yes, the Netherlands. But I'll talk about a little bit broader, because now the Gravio Committee we have already nine reports ready. They are in the public website. You can see them, and 8 reports are coming. So now there is a first photo, so to say. And what we see is that there is no ideal country in Europe. It doesn't exist, because all countries have to make steps, but they have to make steps from a different starting point.
Yes.
Yes. But what we can see at the positive side, and I think it's important to look at the positive side, otherwise we lose our energy to go on, is that a number of countries really have improved their legislation, and that is a very important starting point for all the further development in these countries. There are more training activities for police and justice things. There are more coordinating bodies. So the process in itself of the convention and the evaluation puts a little bit of pressure on the countries to set steps forward. So also the countries are looking at each other. So in Europe we see steps, and of course we are not ready in 10 years. I don't believe that personally. But I believe that we will have further steps forward.
So you are optimistic.
Yes.
We like to hear that. The same question to Mr. Kafle. What do you think governments are doing right, and what could they be doing better?
Though the legislation of Nepal is considered to be one of the best legislation of South Asia, we have some gaps, mentioned some. Discriminatory laws to privilege such as citizenship from mother's names, equal ways. The number of women of Nepal police judicial system and private lawyer is in a small number, because of which survivors cannot get access to justice to time, and even it may not be survivor centuries. Traditional and cultural discrimination on women. Even today, women are abused in the name of witchcraft and chhaupadi. There is a law, but the implementation is not the problem. Is the problem. A meaningful expectations and participation at the decision-making level. The Constitution has guaranteed 33% of women is all level, but it is not in practice in all sectors. We have law on inheritance of property, but very less women have property in their name. Though Nepal is a small country, it has diverse group of people. There are 130 languages and 130 different castes. Hence, this also sometimes causes order in the implementation of laws. For instance, child marriage is treated under the law and legal marriage as in 20, but there are certain communities where child marriage is prevalent. Polygamy is illegal in Nepal, but it still exists.
Yes, thank you. Moving on from this question, maybe Ms. Fukushima, do you have a short answer to this question, please? What is government doing right?
はい、
Yes.
日本は刑法を改正しましたけれども、しかし、まだまだ足りないというふうに思って っています。また DV 防止はありますがフォローアップが少ないです。ですから啓発教育キャンペーンが本当に望まれています。で日本は貧困の問題もまだあって、女性の、暴力の根本原因である貧困を、日本の中でアジアの中で世界の中でどう根絶していくかというのもテーマです。そして今日は世界中からパワフルな、とりわけ女性たちが集まっているので、ぜひ申し上げたいんですが、平時と政治における戦時における暴力、性暴力は地続きです。武力行使で戦争で問題を解決する社会ではなく、暴力のない社会をとりわけ作るように戦時および平時における武力行使、そして、戦争をなくしていく平和の構築のためにも日本からも努力をしていきたいと思っております。
In Japan, the penal code was revised recently, and the anti-domestic violence law is enacted and revised 3 times in Japan. And I think it's really important to have the education or public awareness campaign against violence against women. And also, I think it's a really important issue is that poverty of women, as in Japan, in Asia, and globally. And the last thing I want to say, and not the least, is that with this powerful woman in this conference, I'd like to say that sexual violence in war and peace are the continuum. They're on the same spectrum. So I think it's really important to build the world without war, build the world where violence is not used as a means to solve a problem. Let's create the world of peace.
Thank you, Mr. Fukushima. Thank you. Mr. Kakle, you are the Secretary of Nepal's National Women's Commission, which is one of the commissions set up under the new constitution to help the vulnerable. However, these commissions have been criticized for having not too much backbone, we are afraid to say. And the Women's Commission doesn't yet have a commissioner, so what would you say to these criticisms?
The National Women's Commission became a constitutional in 2015 and has a very important role in the promotion and the protection of human rights. National Women's Commission can provide recommendations to the government of Nepal. There will be one chairperson and 4 commissioners in the commission to be appointed by the government. Lack of chairperson and commissioner definitely have an important role to play. At this moment, government has not appointed them yet, but despite the absence of commissioners, NWC is trying to fill in those gaps. We are running 24 hours helpline to provide support to the survivors to gender-based violence. We have developed referral mechanism, and the Commission is also working towards ensuring quality and working closely in local, federal and provincial government to reduce gender-based violence. Some of the vital decisions cannot be made without commissioners, as chairperson and commissioners are responsible for the lacking important decision. I and the other agencies have also been raising this issue. I hope all the positions will be fulfilled within a few months or a few days.
A few days or a few months? What did you say?
Maybe few days or
A few days.
that is dependent on our government.
Oh, yes. Yes.
It is under discussion.
It's work in progress, I hear you say.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll keep our eye on you though, sir. We will. We have to. That is what we are here for. So, Ms. Manju, the theme of this conference is impact and solidarity. What can the global network of women's shelters do together to make more of an impact?
Thank you. Can I take advantage of have a question to the Nepalese Commission.
Yes, please, but briefly.
Briefly, I served 5 years in a constitutional commission.
Yes.
And the challenge that we face is not that there isn't a will to have this, because they can be beneficial in pushing the gender agenda at a national level. The challenge we have when the appointment processes get politicized, when the mandates have less power than the Human Rights Commission and the best financial resources. So the challenge to keep an eye on is the politicization of these mechanisms.
Definitely. Not Cafe personally, of course, yes.
So in terms of the strengthening of networks, I think just this forum is an indicator that the solidarity, the networking, the collaboration, coordination is part of the violence against women sphere, including the shelter movement. The challenge that faces all the mechanisms that work broadly on human rights, women's rights, violence, is the issue of funding. And that then leads to competing interests, competing for small pots of money, and it causes fragmentation. And people that are natural allies in the sphere of work then start competing against each other. And I think that's a challenge that we have to talk about globally.
I would like to, yes, indeed. I think it's not a break, it's obvious that I let you have the last word on this, because Ms. Manju rightfully says that the funding is small, and it actually drives different groups apart. So could you maybe give us hope for the future on that?
I think we all here, we create hope for the future.
Yes.
And so the Global Network is a network of organizations delivering critical services, essential services. And that's why we have decided, because we are a big formal network without financial needs, that we will try to make a worldwide women's safety web hotline, not only to offer direct services, but also to make ourselves and the essentialness of it visible. And that's our contribution in the whole broad area of things that has to be done. And if everybody delivers a little part, we can, and we do that in solidarity, we can have more impact. I believe that. So,
thank you. Ms. Fukushima gets the last word, short word, thank you, on this matter, the togetherness of the different organizations working together.
そうですね、日本で、女性の暴力が進んだのは、世界のさまざまな法律が視察に行ったりというのにインパクトがあるんですね。女性差別撤廃委員会からの勧告も実に効いています。日本の課題は選択議定書の批准をすることなんですが、こういうインフォーマルな国際会議を続け、インフォーマルにネットワークをし、世界の法制度の交換をすることで、それぞれとりわけアジアに大きなインパクトと連帯があると思います。でぜひ国連は女性に対する暴力撤廃宣言を出していますが、イスタンブール条約のようなものをもし国連が作ったら、それはアジアで世界でとてもインパクトがあると思っていますし、日本にも大きな影響があると思います。ぜひ、将来日本でもこんな会議が開かれたらいいですが、世界中で本当に変えていきましょう。よろしくお願いします。
Please, for the translation, so we understand and say thank you.
Okay, one of the reasons that in Japan the campaign against violence against women was proceeded is because of our overseas inspection on international treaties. I think it's really effective to have general recommendations by CEDAW committee, and it is our issue that Japan has not yet ratified the optional protocol to CEDAW. But I think with all those international frameworks, I think it's really important to learn from overseas, and if the United Nations will create a global legal framework like Istanbul Convention in Europe, then it will be a huge impact on Japan and on Asia. And I hope to have this kind of international global conference in Japan in the future.
Thank you. We will all come. Thank you very much. So So thank you all for joining us in this conversation. Rashida, Manju, Mizuo, Fukushima, Alai Kaduri, and Yureka Kafe, and Yureka. Thank you very much. Thank you, let's go.
Thank you once again to our panelists. Thank you. And thank you to Alice. Okay, that's it for Plenary 4, and we're going to take a break right now. But before we do, I want to show you, and let's have a look how our world map of outlines is doing right now. Okay, yeah, it seems like we're making progress, okay? But we want to do more. We want to see more colors on the map. So do your best. We still have some time today. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let's have a break right now. We'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back for Plenary 5. Thank you.